you know what the Australian people are like? Do you know what kind of country Australia is? These are questions we can answer by seeing Australia, by getting acquainted with the Australian people, by comparing the way things look in Australia with scenes in our country, and by studying Australia on the map. Just where is Australia? For the answer, let's start with the United States. To reach Australia, we could go west to Hawaii, then on across the Great Pacific to Australia. Or we could go east to Europe, across the Middle East, and on across the Indian Ocean to Australia. Either route we take, we go far south of the equator, into the southern hemisphere. Do you see now why Australia is called the land down under? Now let's make a closer comparison with the United States. In our country, we go south to the warm lands near the equator. In Australia, one goes north to the warm regions near the equator. The warmest city in Australia is Darwin, in the north, just as Miami is one of the warmest cities in southern United States. Yes, in the land down under, the climate is the reverse of ours. The cooler lands are in the south, the hotter lands are in the north. What do you think grows in the hot regions of the north? There are tropical forests. Great trees and thick jungle-like growth remind us of the tropical forests of other hot, wet lands near the equator. Fields of sugarcane are another sight we associate with hot, wet lands. Sugarcane grows well in the coastlands of northern and eastern Australia. What would you expect to find in the more temperate lands of the south? Of course, scenes like this. A dairy farm in the temperate lowlands of New South Wales, or an apple orchard that reminds us of those in the northwest part of the United States. Here in Australia, apples are ripe in March, another reminder that the seasons are in reverse of ours in the land down under. The land down under is far from most other lands. In round numbers, it is 4,000 miles to Africa, 10,000 miles to England, 2,000 miles to China, 7,000 miles to the United States. Surrounded by vast oceans, the Australians use ships, large ocean-going ships, to reach and trade with other lands. There are many fine harbors, like this one at Sydney, with its famous bridge, that are centers of ship traffic. Yes, Australia depends upon ships that are lifelines to the ports of other lands, ports such as Hong Kong in Southeast Asia, Dunkirk in France, London in England, and New York in the United States. Growing in importance are the great transoceanic plains that span the seas to all parts of the world. Australians are air-minded and depend on planes for much of their overseas travel. They were pioneers of air travel across the Pacific. So when we say Australia is the land down under, let's remember that Australia is far from the United States and from Europe. Australia is below the equator. The hotter lands are north, the cooler lands are south. Now about the second question we asked. What kind of a country is Australia? Look at the vast stretches of rolling grasslands, the great plains of this country. Look at a country so open and empty that a railroad track can cut across 800 miles of it in almost a straight line. Yes, look at Australia's mountains, and remember this: it's a big country. Australia is almost as large as the United States, but there are differences. About 170 million people live in the United States. Now think of 10 million. That's about the total population of Australia. And that's our second key idea. Australia is an entire continent with a small population. There are places where one man may own several thousand square miles of land. There are places so remote that doctors make their calls by plane, part of the flying doctor service in this spacious land. Yet there are places where population is dense. About 1.5 million people live in the city of Melbourne. Sydney has a population of about 2 million people. How is the population distributed? We know that the more temperate lands are in the south. More than 90% of the people live in the southern half of the continent. Here is the main reason: rainfall. The southeast trade winds bring yearly rainfall to the southeast coast. The westerly winds bring rain during the winter to the southern coast. Inland is a vast desert with scant rainfall. Where do you think most of the people live? Of course, where the best land is. Cities such as Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane are in the most productive part of Australia. Much of the productive land of Australia is used for growing wheat. The size of this farm in New South Wales is 3,000 acres. The Australian wheat farmer harvests his wheat with a machine which he calls a header. The big tractors may have been made in England, in the United States, or in Australia. Harvest time is in summer, that is November and December, when we're having our winter. Wheat grows in regions that get 15 to 25 inches of rain a year. Australians pioneered dry farming in some regions where there is less moisture. Getting enough water for Australia's arid regions is a big problem. This is water that has been stored by Hume Dam, one of many irrigation and hydroelectric projects being built. The more water that can be stored in reservoirs, the more land Australians can irrigate and cultivate. Although Australia's climate is largely dry, sheep can be grazed in these vast areas. Remember scenes like this, scenes of Australia's biggest industry. Some of the largest sheep ranches in the world are here. Flocks are usually very large. Herders ride horseback and use dogs to help herd the sheep. The herders are called drovers. A ranch here is called a station, and each station is often a separate community, miles from the next station. The workmen, called sheep station hands, are directed by the owner. The workmen and their families live on the station. The family pet may often be a kelpie, a dog trained to herd sheep. On most sheep stations, we'll see the all-important pond for storing the water pumped from the well, or bore as it is called, and the sheds where thousands of sheep are shorn every year. Sheep are being shorn at one place or another in Australia during much of the year, beginning in September, which is springtime. Wool from Australian sheep is sold to many countries of the world. More than half of the world's fine wool is grown here. Because of their heavy wool, sheep cannot live in hot, moist regions. That means that the sheep-raising regions are not too close to the coasts, where rainfall is heavy, and they're not in the north, where it's too hot. However, cattle do well in the wet coastlands and the warmer lands of the north. Yes, the great open grasslands of Australia are fine for cattle. As in America, these lands have a history of pioneer settlement. Doesn't this remind you of the cattle and cowboys in the American West? In Australia, cowboys are called stockmen, or drovers. Among the best stockmen in Australia are the dark-skinned natives, descendants of the original tribes who lived in Australia. Today, some of them work on the great cattle stations that are so common in Australia. We've seen lands where wheat, sugarcane, apples, and other crops are produced. We've seen grazing lands where sheep and cattle are raised. Yet the good farmlands are only 1/5 of the continent. The best grazing lands are about 1/3 of the continent. What about the rest of Australia? Much of it is like this, arid country that Australians call the Outback. This open country is the home of the emu, a large Australian bird. Also associated with the Outback is the kangaroo, a common animal in Australia. The most desolate parts of the Outback are called the Never Never, a lonely land with few inhabitants. And farthest inland is the dead heart of Australia, the desert. But even the desert lands offer something. Men have found a wealth of minerals, and mining towns stand in the lonely plains. The town of Broken Hill is built around its rich mines. The lead, silver, and zinc mined here are part of Australia's mineral wealth. Among the minerals are uranium ores. Some uranium from Australia is sold to the United States. In developing their continent, Australians are building industries. The industrial city of Newcastle reminds us of the English mill town of the same name. Australians are working to increase their steel production. Yes, Australia has iron and coal, and there's a big job to be done in developing the resources of our whole continent. So let's remember this. Australia is an entire continent with a small population. And that brings us to our third question. What kind of people are the Australians? The first thing we might notice is that Australians are English-speaking people. Listen to the conversation of the men on the sheep station.
We got 5,000 head in our north paddock, and the feed's not very good. Maybe we better have a look. You blokes get your horses. We'll go and have a quick look-see.
Or listen to these women talking as they hang out clothes on the sheep station.
We won't know ourselves next Monday.
Why, Mum?
Dad's ordered a new washing machine that'll run on our plant. It's on its way up from Sydney.
Let's hear these Australian schoolboys discussing a new American book.
What you got there, Bob? Let's see your book.
It's a new one about jet planes.
About planes? Oh, boy, an American book. Ah, gee, look at this.
It's a beaut.
In a few moments, the boys will be in class listening to their teacher.
Well, now that we've traced the principal sea lanes between Australia and England, tell me, who can show us the principal airway? All right, Ralph.
Yes, Australians are English-speaking people. Not only their language, but their way of life is a heritage of the British Isles. English names and English flavor color many Australian cities. St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne reminds us of the similarities in English and Australian life. On the other hand, a beach scene like this reminds us of Americans on the sunny beaches of Florida or California. A fast game of rugby football on a Saturday afternoon isn't too different from a Saturday game of football in the United States, although rugby is an English game. Yes, Australians have things in common with both England and the United States. Like Americans, they are easygoing and democratic and have a pioneer history in a new land. So let's remember our basic idea. Australians are English-speaking people with a heritage of British culture. We've touched only 3 important concepts about Australia. Australia is the land down under, with seasons the reverse of ours. Australia is an entire continent with a small population. And Australians are English-speaking people with a heritage of British culture. But this is only the beginning. You can read and learn much more about Australia. Who is buying Australia's wheat and other farm products today? What are some of the problems of raising sheep in Australia? What about the vast arid lands of Australia? What is being done to reclaim land? What about rainfall and its effect on the way the land is used? How does trade and shipping relate Australia to the other nations of the world? What about Australia's population? How fast is it increasing? Australia is a young nation, and its people believe in a tremendous future for their great land, the big land down under.